You are standing in a cave in northern Spain. It is 430,000 years ago. In front of you, on the stone floor, is a body. A young adult face down, with two identical dents in the bone above the left eye, not cracks from a fall, not tooth marks from a predator. Two deliberate measured impacts delivered from slightly different angles by the same blunt object, swung by someone standing directly in front of the victim and looking them in the face. Someone killed this person. Not by accident. Not in self-defense. They hit them, watched them stagger, and hit them again. Then they dragged the body to a 13-meter vertical shaft deep inside the cave system and dropped it into the darkness. That skull, known as Cranium 17, was analyzed by Noemi Sala and Juan Luis Arzuaga at the Cima de los Huesos site in Atapuerca and published in PLOS I in 2015. It is the oldest forensic murder case in the entire human lineage, 430,000 years old. And the question it raises is the one you're already thinking. Did humans invent violence, or was violence already there waiting, written into us long before we had a word for it? The answer is not simple. It is not comfortable. And it changes depending on what you mean by violence. Let's start with what came before us, because the evidence for where violence begins does not start with humans. It starts with our closest living relatives. In 1974, at Gombe Stream National Park in Tanzania, Jane Goodall watched something that changed primatology permanently. A community of chimpanzees she had been studying since 1960 split into two groups. The northern group, the Kasakela, had 8 adult males. The southern group, the Kahama, had 6. And over the next 4 years, the Kasakela males did something nobody had documented in a non-human species before. They hunted the Kahama males down one by one. On January 7, 1974, 6 Kasakela males silently crossed into Kahama territory, found a male named Godi feeding alone in a tree, ambushed him, pinned him to the ground, and beat him for over 10 minutes. Godi died shortly after from his injuries. Over the next 4 years, every single Kahama male, Goliath, Day, Charlie, Sniff, Willy Wally, was stalked, isolated, and killed the same way. An elderly female named Madam B was beaten so badly she died 5 days later. By 1978, the Kahama community no longer existed. The Kasakela absorbed their territory. They took their females, and Goodall, who had spent a decade believing chimpanzees were essentially peaceful, had to rewrite everything she thought she knew. Think about why that matters for the question of whether violence is invented or inherited. Chimpanzees share roughly 98.7% of our DNA. We share a common ancestor roughly 6 to 8 million years ago. And they kill strategically in coalitions, targeting the vulnerable when the numerical advantage is overwhelming. Richard Wrangham, a biological anthropologist at Harvard, called this the imbalance of power hypothesis in a 1999 paper in Evolutionary Anthropology. His argument is that lethal coalitionary violence is not a pathology. It is an adaptive strategy. You kill rival males when you outnumber them, you take their territory and your genes spread. But is that just Gombe? Just one community, one forest, one unusual situation. In 2014, Michael Wilson assembled an international team and compiled data from 18 chimpanzee communities and 4 bonobo communities across 5 decades of field observation, 426 combined site years, and published their analysis in Nature. They documented 152 lethal attacks. 92% of the attackers were males. 73% of the victims were either males from rival groups or infants. The average ratio of attackers to victims was 8 to 1, and the killing rate did not correlate with human disturbance or habitat loss. It correlated with population density and the number of competing males. The violence was not caused by us encroaching on their forests. It was generated from within their own social dynamics, which raises an uncomfortable question about what is generated from within ours. Now, here is where someone usually says, but what about bonobos? Bonobos are closely related to chimpanzees. They share roughly the same amount of DNA with us, and they are famous for resolving conflicts through sexual contact rather than lethal aggression. Out of the 152 killings Wilson documented, only 1 suspected killing occurred among bonobos. 1. Does that not prove violence is optional? It proves violence is variable. Bonobos live in dense, food-rich forests south of the Congo River, where female coalitions dominate social structure and male coalitions are weaker. The ecology is different. The power dynamics are different. And the violence rate is different, but the capacity is still there. Bonobos still fight. They still bite. They still form coalitions. The hardware exists in both species. What differs is how often the hardware gets used and under what circumstances. In 2016, a team led by Jose Maria Gomez at the University of Granada published a study in Nature that tried to quantify exactly how much of that hardware we inherited. They compiled records of over 4 million deaths across 1,024 mammalian species from 137 families and mapped the rate of lethal violence, deaths caused by members of the same species, across the entire mammalian family tree. Across all mammals, the baseline rate was about 0.3%, roughly 1 in every 330 deaths. But primates were different. The primate rate was 2.3%, about 8 times the mammalian average. And when Gomez used phylogenetic modeling to predict what the ancestral rate of lethal violence should be for the human lineage specifically, the number came back at roughly 2%, 1 in 50. That is not a cultural invention, that is a phylogenetic inheritance. We come from a line of social territorial primates, and social territorial primates kill each other at rates far higher than almost any other group of mammals. Bats, whales, rabbits, they almost never kill their own kind. Primates do, and we are primates. Now here's the part that connects directly to how violence actually works inside your skull, because the capacity for violence is not just written into our evolutionary lineage, it is physically mapped in your brain. The neuroscience of aggression runs through a circuit that starts in the amygdala, the brain's rapid threat detection hub, and passes through the hypothalamus, which functions as a kind of activation switch. In 2011, David Anderson's laboratory at Caltech published a paper in Nature showing that optogenetically stimulating a specific cluster of neurons in the ventromedial hypothalamus of mice, called the VMHVL, instantly triggered attack behavior, even against inappropriate targets. The mouse would lunge at anything in the cage. That is the neural hardware for reactive aggression, the hot, impulsive, fight-or-flight kind, and sitting on top of that hardware like a brake pedal over an accelerator is the prefrontal cortex, specifically the orbitofrontal and ventromedial prefrontal cortex, which evaluate consequences, factor in social norms, and suppress the impulse before it becomes action. The most famous case study of what happens when that brake fails is Phineas Gage, a railroad foreman who in 1848 had a 3.5-foot iron rod blown through his left frontal lobe. He survived. But the man who woke up was impulsive, profane, and prone to fits of aggression that the old Phineas Gage never displayed. Hannah Damasio and her colleagues reanalyzed Gage's skull using CT reconstruction in 1994 and confirmed that the damage was centered precisely on the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, the exact region that modern neuroscience identifies as the primary brake on impulsive violence. And then there is the genetics. In 1993, geneticist Han Brunner published a study in Science describing a large Dutch family in which 14 males across 5 generations displayed a pattern of severe impulsive aggression, arson, attempted rape, and violent outbursts. Brunner traced the cause to a single nonsense mutation in the MAOA gene on the X chromosome. The mutation knocked out the production of monoamine oxidase A, an enzyme that breaks down serotonin, dopamine, and norepinephrine. Without it, those neurotransmitters accumulated to toxic levels, and the behavioral result was catastrophic impulsivity. This became known as Brunner syndrome. But here's where the story of the MAOA gene gets complicated, and why it matters for understanding violence. In 2002, Avshalom Caspi, Terry Moffat, and their colleagues published a landmark study in Science following 442 males from the Dunedin longitudinal study in New Zealand from birth to age 26. They found that a common low-activity variant of MAOA, called MAOA-L, did not predict violent behavior on its own. By itself, the gene did nothing. But among boys who suffered severe childhood maltreatment, physical abuse, sexual abuse, or neglect, those carrying the MAOA-L variant were dramatically more likely to develop antisocial behavior. 85% of maltreated MAOA-L boys developed conduct disorder. The gene loaded the gun. The environment pulled the trigger. Neither alone was sufficient. Someone later called MAOA-L the warrior gene. That label is misleading to the point of being dangerous. The low-activity variant occurs in roughly 30 to 40% of most populations, and in some East Asian populations, it reaches 60 to 77%, populations with some of the lowest violent crime rates on Earth. The gene does not make you violent. It alters how your brain processes stress if your environment subjects you to extreme stress during development. Context is everything. And speaking of context, there is a hormone most people blame for violence that deserves a correction: testosterone. The common assumption is simple: more testosterone equals more aggression. Robert Sapolsky, a neuroendocrinologist at Stanford who has spent decades studying wild baboons in Kenya, has spent most of his career explaining why that assumption is wrong. In his 1997 book The Trouble with Testosterone and his 2017 synthesis Behave, Sapolsky laid out what the data actually shows. Testosterone does not generate aggression from nothing. It operates through what he calls a permissive effect. Basal levels of testosterone are necessary for the aggressive circuitry to function, but within the normal physiological range, higher testosterone does not predict more violence. What testosterone actually does is lower the threshold for social status seeking. In a context where status is gained through aggression, testosterone amplifies aggression. In a context where status is gained through generosity, testosterone amplifies generosity. A 2010 study by Christoph Eisenegger in Nature gave women either testosterone or a placebo and had them play an economic fairness game. Women who received actual testosterone made fairer, more cooperative offers. Women who merely believed they had received testosterone, regardless of whether they actually did, behaved more aggressively. The myth of testosterone caused more aggression than the molecule. But here's where the biology gets genuinely strange. Because humans are not just violent primates, we are, by almost every measurable standard, the most docile primates on the planet when it comes to everyday social interactions. Chimpanzees in the same troop bite, hit, and physically intimidate each other at rates roughly 1,000 times higher than humans in comparable social settings. We share space with strangers on trains. We stand in lines. We hand money to people we have never met and trust that they will hand us coffee. That level of social tolerance is extraordinary in the primate world. In his 2019 book, The Goodness Paradox, Richard Wrangham proposes that humans did something no other species has done. We domesticated ourselves, and the mechanism was execution. Here is how it works. In chimpanzee societies, a physically dominant, reactively aggressive male can terrorize the group because no individual subordinate can challenge him alone. But humans invented two things that changed that equation: weapons and language. A spear does not care how strong you are. It kills you in your sleep, and language lets subordinate males whisper, conspire, and coordinate behind a bully's back. Anthropologist Christopher Boehm documented this pattern in his 1999 book Hierarchy in the Forest. In hunter-gatherer societies across the world, overly aggressive, domineering individuals were systematically monitored, ridiculed, ostracized, and in extreme cases, killed by a coalition of the group. Capital punishment. Carried out not by a state but by the community itself. And Wrangham argues that this process, repeated across hundreds of thousands of years, functioned as artificial selection. The most reactively violent individuals were culled before they could reproduce. Over deep evolutionary time, this selected for reduced reactive aggression, the hot, impulsive kind, while leaving proactive aggression, the cold, calculated, planned kind, completely intact. We became calmer on the surface and more lethal underneath. The bully is rare. The war council is universal. The physical evidence supports this. Compared to archaic humans like Homo heidelbergensis and Neanderthals, modern Homo sapiens have flatter brow ridges, smaller teeth, reduced jaw size, and roughly a 10% reduction in brain volume over the last 30,000 years. Those are the same morphological changes you see in every domesticated animal compared to its wild ancestor. Dogs compared to wolves. Dmitry Belaev's silver foxes in Novosibirsk, selectively bred since 1959 for tameness alone, developed floppy ears, curly tails, shorter snouts, and reduced adrenal glands within 50 generations. In 2014, Adam Wilkins, Wrangham, and Tecumseh Fitch published a paper in Genetics proposing that all of these changes trace back to a single developmental mechanism, reduced neural crest cell proliferation, which simultaneously affects adrenal glands, craniofacial structure, and pigmentation. Select for tameness, and the face changes as a byproduct. We bred the visible rage out of ourselves. But we kept the capacity to plan a war. And what about the weapons themselves? Because you cannot separate the history of violence from the history of the tools that made it efficient. In 1994, archaeologist Hartmut team began excavating a lignite mine in Schöningen, Germany, and found something extraordinary preserved in waterlogged lake sediments. 9 wooden spears carved from spruce trunks dating to roughly 300,000 years ago. Each one was between 6 and 7.5 feet long. Each one had its center of gravity positioned in the front third of the shaft, exactly like a modern Olympic javelin. These were not crude sticks. They were precision instruments designed for throwing built by Homo heidelbergensis, the same species found at Cima de los Huesos. 16,000 butchered horse bones were found at the same site. These people were coordinated big game hunters with sophisticated projectile technology 300,000 years ago. And that technology, designed to kill horses, could kill people just as easily. The moment you can throw a lethal object from 30 meters away, the calculus of violence changes completely. Fast forward to 3300 BC. A man we now call Otzi was crossing a high alpine pass in what is now the border between Austria and Italy when someone shot him in the back with a flint-tipped arrow. The arrowhead severed his left subclavian artery. He bled to death within minutes. But here is the detail that tells you something about what violence had become by then. He had a deep knife wound on his right hand, sustained 24 to 72 hours before his death. He had been in a fight days earlier, survived it, fled into the mountains, and was hunted down and killed from behind. The arrow shaft had been snapped off, possibly to retrieve it or conceal the weapon. This was not a random encounter. This was a pursuit. So if the capacity for violence is inherited, and the impulse for reactive aggression has been dampened by self-domestication, and the tools for killing have been refined for 300,000 years, when did violence organize itself into something we would recognize as warfare? When did it go from one person killing another to groups killing groups? The oldest evidence for chronic repeated intergroup violence comes from a cemetery on the east bank of the Nile in Sudan called Jebel Sahaba, excavated by Fred Wendorf in the 1960s as part of a UNESCO rescue mission before the flooding of Lake Nasser. In 2021, Isabelle Crèvecoeur and a team of researchers published a reanalysis in Scientific Reports that examined all 61 skeletons from the site using high-resolution digital microscopy and micro-CT scanning. The results were staggering. 41 of the 61 individuals, 67%, showed evidence of violent trauma. Over 100 newly identified lesions, embedded stone projectile points in spinal columns and pelvic bones, cut marks from stone blades, blunt force fractures to skulls, and 16 of those individuals had both healed wounds from previous attacks and fresh, lethal wounds from the attack that killed them. These were people who had survived violence before, recovered, and then been killed in a subsequent attack. The cemetery dates to roughly 13,000 to 14,000 years ago during the late Pleistocene, when the Younger Dryas climate crisis was squeezing the Nile into a wild Nile regime of extreme fluctuation. Human populations were compressed into narrow corridors of survivable land. The food was running out, the space was shrinking, and the killing was not a one-time event. It was endemic, spanning decades or centuries. Men, women, and children indiscriminately wounded. 1,000 years later, at Naturuk, near Lake Turkana in Kenya, a team led by Marta Mirazon-Lar at Cambridge University found the remains of 27 people lying in the mud of an ancient lagoon. Their findings, published in Nature in 2016, describe something that looks unmistakably like a massacre. 10 of the 12 articulated skeletons showed lethal trauma. Skulls caved in by heavy wooden clubs or stone maces, obsidian arrow tips lodged in bones. And the obsidian was not local. It came from somewhere else, meaning the attackers traveled to do this. They brought weapons made from materials that did not exist in the area. This was not a spontaneous fight. It was a planned attack by outsiders. One individual, a woman in the late stages of pregnancy with fetal remains still preserved in her pelvic cavity, was found with her knees broken, her hands crossed at the wrists, as if she had been bound. Nobody buried these people, nobody arranged them. They were left where they fell, face down in the mud, roughly 10,000 years ago. The oldest clear evidence of a premeditated intergroup massacre. And if you think organized violence calmed down once people settled into villages and started farming, the archaeological record says the opposite. At Talheim in Germany, a mass grave from roughly 5000 BC contained 34 bodies, 18 adults and 16 children, belonging to the linear Ban-Karamic farming culture. Every one of them had been killed. 20 had their skulls shattered from behind by stone adzes. This was a village wiped out in a single attack by a neighboring farming community, analyzed by Christian Meyer and published in detail in 2014. At Schöneck-Kilienstatten, also in Germany, from roughly the same period, 26 people were massacred and their shin bones systematically smashed, deliberate mutilation inflicted before or after death. At Crow Creek in South Dakota, around 1325 AD, archaeologists Larry Zimmerman and Douglas Owsley excavated a fortification ditch containing 486 skeletons. 90% had been scalped. Skulls were caved in by stone war clubs. Tongues were cut out, hands and feet were severed as trophies. Young women between 15 and 30 were statistically absent from the dead, meaning they had been taken alive. The attackers slaughtered children, older women, and men, and abducted the young women. Tree ring data confirmed a multi-decade megadrought on the northern Great Plains at the time. The crops had failed, and the violence was total. Now, there's a number that puts all of this into perspective. Lawrence Keeley, an archaeologist at the University of Illinois, published a book in 1996 called War Before Civilization. He compiled warfare death rates from dozens of non-state societies and compared them to modern state warfare. In tribal societies, roughly 500 out of every 100,000 people died from warfare every year. The annual rate for the United States in the 20th century, including both World Wars, Korea, and Vietnam, was about 15 per 100,000. If modern nations had suffered the proportional death rates of pre-state tribal societies, the global toll for the 20th century would have exceeded 2 billion people. 2 billion? not 100 to 150 million. 2 billion. Samuel Bowles, an economist at the Santa Fe Institute, put it another way in a 2009 paper in Science. He examined 8 archaeological datasets and 8 ethnographic hunter-gatherer populations and found that intergroup warfare accounted for roughly 14% of all adult deaths. 1 in 7 adults died from violence inflicted by other humans, and that rate was high enough, Bowles calculated using multi-level selection models, to drive the genetic evolution of altruistic self-sacrifice in warfare, what he called parochial altruism. The willingness to die for your group precisely because the threat from other groups was so constant and so real, and then things changed. The state arrived. Thomas Hobbes, writing in Leviathan in 1651, described life without centralized government as a war of all against all, a condition in which there are no arts, no letters, no society, and which is worst of all, continual fear and danger of violent death, and the life of man solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. His proposed solution was the Leviathan, a sovereign authority to which individuals surrender their private right to violence in exchange for collective security. Max Weber formalized this in 1919 by defining the state as the entity that successfully claims the monopoly of the legitimate use of physical force within a given territory. And the data, imperfect and debated as it is, suggests Hobbes was not entirely wrong. Criminologist Manuel Eisner compiled European judicial records spanning 8 centuries and published his analysis in 2003. In medieval Oxford in the 1340s, the homicide rate was roughly 110 per 100,000 people per year. By the 20th century, it had dropped below 1 per 100,000, a 100-fold decline. Steven Pinker, in his 2011 book, The Better Angels of Our Nature, marshaled this data alongside dozens of other metrics to argue that violence has been declining for millennia, driven by centralized states, trade, literacy, the expansion of empathy through the printing press and the novel, and what philosopher Peter Singer called the expanding circle of moral concern, from family to clan to nation to all of humanity. But here's the counter-argument, and it matters. Nassim Nicholas Taleb and Pasquale Cirillo published a paper in Physica A in 2016, pointing out that war deaths follow a fat-tailed power law distribution, meaning the average is misleading because the catastrophic outliers, the world wars, the genocides, are so extreme that the historical sample mean understates the true expected risk. 70 years without a World War III is statistically consistent with a random process where the next catastrophic event simply has not happened yet. The frequency of interpersonal violence has dropped, yes, but the capacity for organized destruction has not. It has increased. The 20th century killed between 150 and 200 million people through war and state-sponsored mass murder. Political scientist R.J. Rummel called it democide. The same century that produced the United Nations produced Auschwitz, the Gulag, and Hiroshima. The bully was suppressed. The War Council was not. So here is the answer. Did humans invent violence? No. And yes. The capacity for lethal aggression is not a human invention. It is a primate inheritance, baked into our phylogeny at a rate of roughly 2%, roughly 8 times the mammalian average, according to Gomez's 2016 analysis. Chimpanzees kill. Our ancestors killed the neural circuitry for aggression, the amygdala, the hypothalamus, the serotonergic and dopaminergic systems that modulate it. Those are millions of years old. The oldest murder on record is 430,000 years old, and it probably was not the first. Violence is not something humans dreamed up one afternoon. It was already there when we arrived, but warfare, the organized, premeditated, large-scale application of lethal force by one group against another, that is an invention. It required specific preconditions that did not exist for most of human history: sedentism, stored surplus, territory worth defending. Populations too large for personal relationships to manage conflict, exceeding Robin Dunbar's cognitive limit of roughly 150 stable social relationships. Weapons sophisticated enough to project force at a distance. And, perhaps most critically, the cognitive architecture for proactive aggression, the cold, premeditated kind, which Wrangham argues was amplified by the same self-domestication process that suppressed the hot, reactive kind. We calmed the individual, we armed the group. The probability that some form of interpersonal violence would have emerged in any social primate species with our brain size, our social complexity, and our territorial behavior is, based on the comparative phylogenetic data, essentially 100%. Violence was coming no matter what. But the probability that it would have organized itself into warfare, into armies, into sieges, into systematic slaughter, given agriculture, surplus, and population density, is roughly 85 to 90%, based on its independent emergence on every inhabited continent from Sudan to Germany to South Dakota to Kenya. The specific forms were shaped by circumstance. The general pattern was nearly inevitable. And that distinction is what the Seville Statement on Violence was trying to articulate. In 1986, 20 scientists from across neurobiology, ethology, and anthropology gathered in Seville, Spain, and issued 5 declarations, later adopted by UNESCO. Their core conclusion was this: biology does not condemn humanity to war. Just as wars begin in the minds of men, peace also begins in our minds. The same species that invented the spear invented the treaty. The same brain that houses the amygdala houses the prefrontal cortex. The same evolutionary pressures that gave us coalitionary killing also gave us coalitionary cooperation, the ability to build alliances, share food, raise each other's children, and suppress the bully in the group through collective action rather than collective slaughter. Tonight somewhere, someone will choose not to hit someone who made them angry. They will feel the impulse, the old primate circuitry firing in the amygdala, the hypothalamus priming for action, and the prefrontal cortex will say, no, not worth it, not here, not now. That pause, that fraction of a second between the impulse and the decision, is not the product of 430,000 years of murder. It is the product of 430,000 years of learning what murder costs. We did not invent violence, we inherited it. What we invented, slowly, imperfectly, and never permanently, is the choice not to use it. And whether that invention holds is, every single day, entirely up to us.